Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. Today, our guest is Leo Bottary. He assists companies to build high-performing teams in the workplace, and he assists business leaders maximize their peer group experiences. His latest book is Peernovation: What Peer Advisory Groups Can Teach Us About Building High-Performing Teams. Leo, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you. So give us a little bit of background on yourself. Where did you grow up? What was your upbringing life like? How did you get from where you started to where you are today?
Wow. I'll try to be succinct about this at least, but I grew up in the Boston area. I actually grew up in a little peninsula called Howe's Neck, which is part of Quincy. Quincy borders Boston to the south. And if you look over Quincy Bay, you can actually see downtown Boston, where I was a huge Red Sox, Bruins, Celtics, and Patriots fans, even when the Patriots couldn't buy a football game back when I was growing up. But, it was all about Boston sports. And I think other things there that were a great influence were, there were just a lot of, cultural options there. There were wonderful museums. There's an incredible, you've got the Boston Symphony Orchestra. You've got, a wonderful theater scene there. And of course, back in the day, you had 77 institutions of higher education, either 2 or 4 year schools, all in the greater Boston area. So I think there was an aspirational part of that and feeling like I wanted to further my education and, do that. So, that was, I think, a big part of my upbringing. And the influences around that were, pretty profound, I think, in a lot of ways. But at the end of the day, I wanted to kind of move beyond the peninsula, if you will, and went to college in Florida, lived in Florida for a while, lived in Colorado for a while. Here and now I've spent over a decade in Southern California. And, I think doing what we all try to do in our lives is just try to broaden our perspective and meet new people, travel, do everything that helps us do that. And that's kind of how I kind of found my way into what I did for 25 to 30 years, which was corporate communications, which effectively, because I did that work for Vistage, a company that assembles and facilitates peer advisory groups for, CEOs and other business leaders for a number of years, it now brought me into the work I do today for peer groups and for organizational work teams. And I'm having the most fun I've ever had. So good stuff.
Great. Well, we kind of traded places. I grew up in California. Now I'm living in the Boston area. You grew up in the Boston area. Now you're in Southern California. And I love Boston, but as far as the weather goes, I really like that California winter weather. That's great stuff.
If what living different places really taught me was to try to stay away from comparisons as best you can. Every place has its own real great stuff and its own little trade-offs, but I think when we can appreciate where we live for what it is, I think Boston's a magnificent city. Obviously, I go back there every year. Unfortunately, I missed my annual visit to Fenway Park this year, which I was a little bummed about. But it's a really cool place to live, and yet I love it here as well because the weather is just pretty much 72 and sunny a lot. So it's nice.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful time of year here right now with fall colors. All the trees are red and yellow and orange, and it's just amazing. We don't get fall leaves like that in Southern California, so I'm loving it here. So tell us a little bit more about the business you have right now and who you work with.
So for the past 4 years, so what happened was, I'm going to back up just a little bit, because when I was with Vistage, I was there for about 6+ years handling corporate communications and brand stuff. In late 2012, I actually led a brand refresh for the company and did a lot of focus groups with CEOs and other key executives and would ask them, what do you do to learn and grow and bring new ideas into your company? And what they would tell me is, well, I hire coaches, we hire consultants, we go to executive development programs at Harvard and Stanford, I read books. And nobody, at least in an unassisted way, was bringing up that, being part of a peer group is part of my consideration set. So when the rebranding piece was done with Vistage, I basically said to the CEO and to the board, we're trying to sell a Mercedes to someone who doesn't even know what a car is. And, at the bottom line. So I thought, let's see if we can. We weren't the only ones to do it by any means. There's certainly some other good work out there, but we wanted to develop a narrative that didn't just serve as a hardcover brochure for Vistage, but looked at the entire category, looked at Vistage, EO, YPO, different peer groups around the world. We looked at Bill George's work, as you know, close to you at Harvard Business School, does a lot of work around, the power of peers and starting your own groups. So looking at that and coming up with what we did was created the narrative around it called The Power of Peers, which was the first book, which talked about basically made the case for how and why peer groups work so well and why you should consider really using one.
So that first book was inspired by your work at Vistage. Was it kind of a Vistage book, or was this your own book that you were writing based on your experiences with Vistage?
I would say both, in that I was co-authored with the CEO of Vistage at the time, but it wasn't about Vistage per se. We really stepped back, looked at the entire category. And I think that was the big difference with it, and where we really saw the value, where other people really could get benefit for it and wouldn't regard it as a Vistage book, per se. But then what happened after that was I had a bunch of Vistage chairs who basically said to me, and Vistage chairs, these are the people who lead these peer groups, said, all right, what are you going to do with this now? You've got this book, you've got these 5 factors that are so critical to what makes for high performing groups. What are you going to do with it? So I essentially created a group self-assessment. And later I use it as an aspirational exercise for brand new groups as well. And since developing that workshop, I've done it now for about 150 CEO peer groups, mostly Vistage, but I've also done it with teams and cross-functional work teams as well, and really saw the value of what peer groups have to teach us about what we can bring to our teams and how we can make them that much better. And not to mention, I think a lot of companies should have groups and teams in their companies, not just teams. So it's been really, really fun, and it's what led to writing the latest book, Peernovation, and basically taking all the data and all the other additional experiences from that, putting it into a book where people could not only see it as something that advances the content for people who lead groups that they can continue to use, but also to see the relevance for high-performing teams and to bring this into their companies and bring it into their organizations. And I think it's really simple, but really powerful.
Mm-hmm. And I really want to dig into Peernovation and spend most of our time there. But real quick before we go there, so this book was launched while you were working at Vistage. And what was the goal? How were you measuring success in terms of this book? Was it a tool you were going to give to everybody who was in Vistage? Was it a recruitment marketing tool? How were you deciding, hey, this worked or it didn't work?
Yeah, I think there were a number of things. And of course, this is the original book, The Power of Peers, back in March of 2016. Clearly, it was something that we felt was not only instructive and helpful for Vistage chairs who led groups and also brand new chairs who were just starting to lead groups. We felt that was helpful. It was also good for chairs who were recruiting new members. If you want to know what the peer group experience is all about, here's a book and have a look at it and get a sense of really what you're getting yourself into here. Now, Vistage would deliver its own brand of, peer advantage, if you will, is kind of what we talked about in the book. But by and large, it would really serve as a primer for people who were unfamiliar with what a peer advisory group would be like. Now, we certainly wanted to use it and be able to use it directly. But at the same time, of course, we wanted to extend the reach of that book, as well, in terms of other people who lead peer groups wherever. It was the kind of thing where maybe a Vistage group is right for you, or maybe it wasn't, but we'd like you to become part of a group somewhere. And that was really the larger mission for it.
Got it. And then in between that book, your first one, and this latest one, Peernovation, you had another book in the middle there, right?
Yeah, it was called What Anyone Can Do. And what happened after the The Power of Peers was written as I was approached by a great guy. His name is Randy Cantrell, and we had a podcast. And we started this podcast where we did what was called the Year of the Peer. And so by definition, right, we're going to do our 50 episodes. We're going to have all these amazing guests, and they're going to talk to us about themselves, their careers, their companies, and the importance of really their peers and the people who influence them. It was pretty clear, of course, that with everyone we met with, and it was authors, academics, CEOs, all kinds of leaders in media and everywhere else, that nobody became successful all by themselves, right? They clearly had a lot of help along the way. And so I basically looked at all of the information, all these incredible learnings we were getting from these people, and I combined it with, I thought about a line that I had read in a book years earlier by Joe Henderson. And Joe Henderson is a former editor for Runner's World. And, he basically wrote this book called The Long Run Solution, where he talked about successful runners and successful people in general and said, you look at people who are really successful, it isn't that they can leap tall buildings in a single bound and do superhuman things that none of us can do. They do the things that anyone can do, but most of us never will, right? So the idea of what anyone can do is to say, you know what, if you surround yourself with the right people and you make your intentions public with them, you are likely to do the things that anyone can do far more often. So that's really kind of where that concept went. And in many respects, that finds its way into Peernovation as well, because the whole premise of Peernovation really is the power of we begins with me, and that everyone recognizes the role they have in a team. And it isn't just to fill a spot, it's to make a difference. And how do I own that? How do I, be part of the kind of team where we accept that as our personal responsibility to one another? So it kind of all finds its very interesting path where it's easy to connect the dots going backwards, as you all know, sometimes, but we're just kind of exploring and discovering and keeping our eyes and ears open. And that's kind of what led to the book that's out now.
So when it comes to Peernovation, did the idea for that start when you were still at Vistage, or was this something you came up with after? What was the inspiration to start that book?
Well, the inspiration to start that book was certainly after I left Vistage, and it was largely because I started to see the parallels between what would work for high-performing groups and high-performing teams. The name itself I first used it in a blog post back in 2012. But, clearly, again, as the content was kind of developing around now, and I was trying to look at what are the outcomes of peer advantage, which is basically what happens when we're more selective, strategic, and structured about the people we surround ourselves with. Peernovation became kind of the natural, answer to that, being this combination of peers, people like me, and innovation, creativity realized. And that's essentially where the name comes from.
Got it. So when did you start working on that book?
I would say about a year and a half ago, when I first started really assembling in a real serious way all the data from the peer advisory group workshops that I had done, and started to see the patterns there, and really started to take some pretty diligent notes, and then be watchful and mindful of things as I continued to do workshops that built on a lot of this early findings. And then, of course, you always continue to discover new things with every group. The thing about the workshop I do is it doesn't presume to tell anyone, here's what you should be doing, or here's what's right for you or not, or anything. It's more of a framework that allows for them to discover that for themselves, own that, and then execute on it.
So how did you do your research? I mean, you're doing these meetings and you knew you were going to use some of this data for the books, but how did you structure collecting the research and making sure that it was going to meet your needs for the book?
Well, first of all, it's a great point that I probably didn't go into it with the idea that it was going to be a book at all. So I just structured the research almost in the same way. You have to imagine that the initial work that I did on the Power of Peers, even though you've got a book that might be whatever it was, 180 pages or something like that, there were probably 2,500 pages worth of notes, right? So there was a lot of data. There's a lot of transcripts from interviews and things like that. So it was a bit of going back to a lot of that and kind of rethinking all of that, especially as it related to the workshops and what it might mean to high-performing teams. And then, again, as I started to think about the fact that there could be a book in the offing here, because I started to feel so strongly that the relevance to teams was so profound that, again, I would just basically take notes at the end of any given workshop. I would always still, read other people's articles and things out there. I would look at the academic literature. A.T.N. Wenger, for example, who basically is the father of the term communities of practice, is someone who is a great influence on a lot of this work. And, at the end of the day, in addition to on one hand, you're trying to write about it, but you also have to continue to be a student of it at the same time. And that's really kind of what keeps you sharp and pretty current.
Mm-hmm. So what does your writing process look like? How did you go about writing Peernovation, and how has that changed since you wrote your first book?
So I think the process is similar, and that I had an idea, at least for a working title in my mind, which gave me kind of a general theme for the book. Then I'd start thinking about, I think about it like building a house, like I'm framing a house. I'm kind of doing the architecture first before I start moving the furniture in, right? So I start with a basic outline and really try to craft out the chapters. And then underneath these chapters, just take notes to make sure that I have enough heft and that the narrative builds in a way and tells the story the way that I wanted to. Then I think about not just data, but stories that support each of those chapters, because obviously story is really important. It really connects people. Heather Pemberton Levy, who was the editor for the first book, has a great book herself. And it's really about kind of story first is the name of it. And it really talks about, how to go about doing that. But in terms of the process of writing the book, some people are really great about like, okay, I spent X number of hours every day. There's a certain time I write, there's a certain amount of stuff I want to do. And I'm like the opposite of that, in terms of, so what works for me is there'll be 2 days or more where I don't want to get near it. And then there's another day where I'm just like, I can't be stopped. I'll be sitting my laptop and it'll be 6 a.m. Next thing I know, it's 6 p.m. And I've just blown through all kinds of, and really do a lot to lay everything down as best I can, and then really go back through it. I would say that one thing that I've found out is every time I think I'm just laying it down, and not trying to over-edit, over-control, overdo anything at that stage of the game, I often find when I go back through it, that first pass at it is better than I thought it was, because, and not for any reason other than it's just flowing from you in a way that you're just telling the story, and it's not trying to be overly contrived or anything like that. And I find that by and large, it can hold up better than you might think. So
a lot of writers talk about being in this state of flow and it just flowing out of them. Have you always seen yourself as a writer, or where did that side of you come from?
I've always had to write ever since my first job, where I was writing speeches for the CEO of the Stop and Shop companies, which back then was a $4 billion diversified retailer out of Austin, by the way. And they owned Stop and Shop supermarket companies, but also Bradley's, which was pretty much like the Target of its day, along with a drugstore and a number of other retailers. But since writing speeches there, if you're in corporate communications, PR, you're writing all kinds of articles. So I've written a million kind of magazine articles, blog posts, and all that. I think there's a difference between being a writer and then making that transition to being an author, where all of a sudden now, the idea of doing a 800 to 2,000 word article versus a 40, 50, 60,000 word book is just a different, there's geometry to that, if you will, that kind of changes things. But
yeah, it's not like you can just sit down and crank out a 60,000 word book the way that you can do an article.
Right. I mean, so I read a lot of articles, as you know, for CEO world, and those are right around 800 to 1,000 words, and they just don't take me very long to do. Those are fairly easy to knock out, and I really enjoy doing them, and I like kind of diving deep into a topic like that. But the book has always been fun too, because it's a big puzzle, if you kind of think about it. And as I mentioned, when you initially lay down those chapters, that doesn't mean that by the end that always holds up. I might be shifting some things around or bringing new things to the table that I might not have considered before. And so you just kind of allow for that too, and be forgiving about that, and be okay with that. So.
Thank goodness that writing a book is not like building a house in that sense. With a house, it'd be a little bit hard to move all the rooms around once you've already got them in place. But with a book, it's great because you can say, you know what, I'm going to move this chapter later, and it's not that big a deal.
Except when you're the architect, you still can move it around the paper before you get into the building stage.
At least when you're an architect, yeah. But a book, you can move it around up until that point that you send it out for printing, at least. So
exactly
with Peernovation, was this self-published, or did you work with a publisher on it?
So this was with Archway Publishing out of Simon & Schuster, which is self-published, but it's so interesting in that the process was very, very similar to what I experienced with the first two books when I worked with a publisher. It was actually Bibliomotion out of Boston was the first publisher we worked with back in 2016. It was a smaller publisher who at the time had set itself up to deal with and work with people largely writing business trade books who may not be a household name, but who had good content and who they could help provide resources that they might not get from a larger publisher. So I enjoyed working with them. They were later bought by Taylor and Francis, so I continued to work with them and working with what anyone can do, and enjoyed them a lot and all. But I was actually just interested in trying something a little different. For this third book, I had looked into Archway Publishing's model and found that, wow, I could get the combination of the flexibility in terms of release date and other such things that I wasn't going to get from a traditional publisher, and yet get a lot of resources and a lot of support. And, I will tell you that, like anything, you can look at something and they give you all these promises that this is how it's going to work and it's going to be amazing and it's going to be great. They actually delivered on that for me. I have no complaints at all. If anything, I was really excited about working with them. So if you're interested in getting something that, in my view, is kind of almost a hybrid model, working with them, I found that to be really, really great for me.
Do they refer to themselves as a hybrid publisher?
I don't know that I think it's basically the self-publishing arm of Simon & Schuster is what they are. But again, you get a lot of resources with regard to content review and editing and marketing and all of that. But yet, like I said, I had a lot of flexibility with regard to, title and cover and release date and all kinds of things that sometimes aren't always in your control as much as you'd like with a traditional publisher. So I was, pleased with the model.
So how does it work? Do they own the book, or do you retain ownership of it?
Yeah, I retain ownership of the book, and and the revenue model is better in terms of what I'm able to capture in terms of book sales per book versus a traditional publisher. There is an upfront cost. There's several packages you can buy ahead of time. Some are very minimal, some are a little more. I think of the 4 packages that were available, I felt that for me at least, that kind of the third level package, not the top level, but right near that, was the best for me. And again, I've been really, really happy with what they did, and happy with the physical look of the book. It's right here, at least to show you anyway. And now this is the soft cover. There's a hard cover, and then the ebook is out available as well.
Mm-hmm. So they do give you the option to do a hardcover through them.
Yes.
Unlike Amazon KDP, which you can only do soft cover, of course. So it sounds like it's kind of a step up. I mean, you've got Amazon KDP, which anybody can publish there, but you can only do soft cover, and it's Amazon quality. And then you've got Ingram Spark, where you can do hardcover, but it sounds like this is a step up from that because they offer these other services that you can get editing and other things through them as well.
Yeah, and it kind of gives you the this. I felt it was the combination of flexibility and support that was just the right balance for me, especially having gone through this process a couple times. I think that was helpful as well.
Great. So when was the book released exactly?
October 16th. So it's.
I didn't realize it was that recently. Just a little bit of behind the scenes. I just met Leo yesterday. He was introduced to me through a friend. And so we're coming on this podcast really quick. So I didn't have time to do the research that I normally would do on a guest coming on, but he came through a trusted connection. So I was like, yeah, let's do this. So I'm learning about his book firsthand here rather than normally I'd go out and I'd buy the book and I'd at least skim it and do some research.
But we'll get you one. We'll get you one after the show for sure.
All right. So in terms of cover design, then you had a lot of creative liberty there. What was your thought process going through the cover design and designing the typography and just laying out the book, being responsible for that?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, part of the package that I had was that I had 4 cover designs that were presented to me based on input that I would provide around that. I did have a logo for Peernovation that, my company is actually Peernovation LLC. And I did use the logo as the front, as I mentioned, you've seen this here as a kind of the cover element on the book here with the subhead, what peer advisory groups can teach us about building high performing teams. The subhead to me was really critical because there's a lot of books there about teams. I wanted to be super clear about the fact that this kind of walks through a very specific door when it comes to this whole concept of teams. So, like I said, fortunately, I had a lot of flexibility regarding, title, subhead, and then on the design element, I gave a suggestion of what I thought I wanted, but then I said, "You guys have at it, and let me know what I should come up with." And they came up with a lot of really cool designs. So I was really happy with what they came back to me with. And then I just made a selection and we were off to the races from there.
So for authors who have published a little bit less recently, I'd ask, well, what's the reception been like? Of course, we're talking 7 days after it was released. So it just barely came out. But how are you promoting the book? What are you planning on doing for marketing, or what have you been doing to market it ahead of time?
Yeah, so a fair bit. There is a press release that's going to be going out on it. I will be doing a media tour. I am getting involved in a lot of podcasts. I'm doing a lot of work directly with a lot of the people in my network, which has gotten more and more extensive over the years in terms of directly going to the audiences that I know to whom this would be most relevant, and doing that. So, and then helping extend the reach there, not only in the U.S. but in other areas where I'm working, and that would be contacts I have in China and the UK, Netherlands, Portugal, places like that. In addition to what I do throughout the United States and Canada. So, obviously working through. There's a lot of Vistage chairs out there who have been through the workshop, who appreciate the content, who are very interested in how not only they can continue to use the findings that continue to build on the value proposition of the first book, but also how they can provide this to their members as a way of showing them how they can take a lot of these principles that they've already stuck their hands in the clay in, if you think about it, but really be able to tangibly show them how to bring them into their companies.
You said you're doing a media tour during this period of COVID and lockdowns. What does a media tour for a book look like?
It looks like a real virtual media tour. In fact, it's more of a virtual radio tour that I'm going to be working with a person who was recommended to me by C-Suite Radio. So I have a podcast on C-Suite Radio. So obviously using the podcast as a vehicle to talk about the book and the content and everything as well. But to be a guest on many of the shows that are there, which I think have some really good reach, who will introduce me to some, different audiences, but audiences who would find the content pretty relevant. So there's just kind of a number of things across several platforms that I'm doing to just keep the book out there, extend the reach. One of the things that I did, and also between hardcover and then looking at the paperback and the ebook is that I priced the paperback at $12.99 and the ebook at $3.99. And largely the reason for that was, first and foremost, I want to get this content into as many people's hands as possible. I'd like for team leaders to see it as incredibly affordable to just say, great, I'm going to get a book for every one of my team members. And we can do that. Or someone leading a peer advisory group says, awesome, I can get one of these for every one of my members. And we can look at this and work with it. At the end of the book, there's also a PDF that people can get access to for free off my website. That's basically a 30-page guidebook on how to bring this very specifically to teams in their company.
So I hammer this home in the courses that I offer and through this podcast that you don't make money off the books, generally speaking, off of book sales. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you're using this book to promote yourself, promote your business, build your personal brand, how it fits into your overall marketing plan and business model?
Yeah, it fits into all of those things. So it is trying to drive the business from groups to teams. And that's the, big transition that we're making there, and really excited about that. It's just really about making the connection for people in terms of what this looks like for them and how it'll work, and just to continue to be out there. Again, I think a lot of the direct connections with the network are going to be where this is going to start. The other thing that I'm really looking to do is there's a framework that is central to the book that basically is central to the workshop that I do, which is about a half-day workshop with companies. The two other components I want to bring to it, though, is kind of the relationship piece of it, right? Because when we have teams, having a framework is great, but the relationships obviously become really central to everything. And then third is, how do we actually create habits, right? How do we not just do a workshop? We all look at one another, say, hey, this is what we want to do. This is great. And we go forward. But how do we make sure this is sustainable? And how do we build on that? And how do we keep getting better? So a lot of what I'm doing right now is continuing to advance my work so that I can do something with teams that can help them take this work, but really make it perform well for them over, a number of years, as opposed to being a one and done kind of workshop thing.
So do you see the book being something that people pick it up and that's how they learn about you, and then they say, hey, let's get this guy in to do a workshop? Or do you see it more as a tool that you do these workshops and then you give people the book and say, this is the book that you need to use as kind of the Bible for this workshop? Or is it both?
It's both. It's certainly both. Yeah. And that's a great point. And I'll also continue to write and continue to do other articles again on this to try to draw people into the website to learn more about the book and try to, tease the content in that way. There's a lot of aspects of this when it comes to the what business problem are we trying to solve for piece. And I think for some people, just connecting with them on different levels in that way through some of the various articles will draw them into the content and, go from there. So, for everyone, it's going to be a bit different, for sure. But that's kind of what we're doing.
What would be an ideal outcome from the book? I mean, what would be kind of the dream measurement of success if you could just pick it off the shelf and it happened? Would it be is it somebody hiring you to do a workshop? Is it a speaking opportunity? What's kind of the ideal scenario?
I think the ideal scenario years from now is that Peernovation would be something that a lot of companies would be bringing into their organization. And clearly, it can't just be me delivering that. It will be other people. It will be ways to make it scalable online. There'll be a lot of things to just try to, again, democratize this whole thing, make it really accessible, show the value, prove the value of it. And again, why I think it works so well is it's a real, heuristic approach, right? It's this notion of giving people all the tools and all the framework so they can come to their own conclusion about what they want for themselves and how it's going to fuel their growth or lead to whatever objectives they want to reach for their organization.
I want to go back to something you mentioned about kind of your platform. You were talking about, I mean, you've been in Vistage and you've worked with a lot of companies, so you have a lot of connections. Have you been gathering email addresses and doing a newsletter, or how have you created this group or platform such that when you issued this book, you can contact all these people and say, hey, I've got this book?
Yeah. So my personal email list of contacts that I literally feel comfortable enough in sending individual emails to, which is exactly what I'm doing, is right around 9,000. And again, it isn't so much how many, but it's who, both in terms of the likelihood they might take an interest and do something with it, and also who would share it and extend the reach of that list. So that's a big part of it. I do not have a newsletter at the moment, and that is going to commence probably right after the first of the year, where after we've got some traction with the book and we continue to share a lot of the content that can help people drill down into specific areas of it, there'll be a newsletter that I'll have from there, and that will be accompanied certainly with continued weekly podcasts. So there we have it. Mm-hmm. For now, I'm always looking for opportunities and new ideas. And, it's so interesting when I've done a lot of this work for so many other people for so many years that now all of a sudden, here I am kind of having to do it for myself and this company and this book. It's always a fun challenge. And so I'm just kind of trying to take things, it's not unlike how we might approach social media, right? Where we'd rather be deep on fewer platforms that really hit our target audience as opposed to spreading ourselves all over the place. So I think I'm just trying to make some really good choices about where I can invest time, that reaches the right people in the right way at this point.
Mm-hmm. Going back to your process a little bit more. So the publisher, again, it was Archway, is that correct?
Yes.
So with Archway, did you use an editor through them, or did you hire an editor outside of Archway?
I could choose either way. I ended up choosing one of their editors. It seemed to make the most sense, to be honest. And because you're hiring an editor that is already aligned with a lot of their standards and what they want to do. And that worked out well. So it was a content review, first of all, and then I had a line edit done a little later on.
Mm-hmm. And tell us more about that process. How did you work with the editor? What worked? What didn't work? Maybe what are some lessons? Because a lot of the first-time authors listening to this podcast are coming into this really new and saying, well, yeah, it'd be nice to hire an editor, maybe. But what was your experience like, and what recommendations would you give to first-time authors who are just exploring this process?
Well, first of all, as you well know, there's a lot of really experienced authors that always hire an editor every time. And there's a reason they do that. And it's not unlike when I was doing a lot of work with academic papers, and you'd have to have something in APA formatting. Well, nobody who does that, is an APA expert usually. So in order to get that done and really done right, you want to have someone who is really steeped in the minutia of all of that. So, and I think the same holds true with a book when you wanted to get it to true publishing standards, which typical is kind of Chicago style, framework for that. Having someone at least who brings it to that publishing standard, I think, is important in terms of the professionalism of the book and all that. Second, it's having someone who looks at the book, because we all get in our own heads with this, and even if we have the other people read it, it's really helpful to have someone who pretty much doesn't know anything about the content, and who has to read it in a way where they have to be able to get it. And I think it's always really, really helpful in that regard. And they'll see things, they'll notice things, they will. And I found that process really good. There was very little back and forth in my situation, as it turns out, and that may have been some, had something to do with the fact that I'd kind of been through this a couple of times, and had the manuscript in maybe a little better shape than what I might have done, in my first or second book. But I felt that the process was good, and there were some things I would only say that whether it's Archway or anyone else, if you have an editor go through your book and they say, okay, we've proofed it, we've put it to professional standards, we have our own little notes and things on it, you still have to go through it really, really carefully and make sure that it's where ultimately you want the book to be. It doesn't mean that every change they made is something you have to accept, particularly if someone inadvertently alters the meaning of something that can be so nuanced that they don't necessarily see or understand the difference. So I would say from a process standpoint, that way, there was a round where, I got an initial edit and there was certainly things that I had to send back in that regard. So.
Was there any point during the writing process where you wondered if this book was really going to happen? Any point that you got bogged down at, or just any challenge that you faced? And if so, how did you overcome that?
I would say not this one, but I would say the other two, sure. I would say it's easy to get 3/4 of the way through or 80% there and then start losing a little steam and not feeling that level of, rigor about it all, and wanting to make sure that I'm putting the same level of energy into the latter chapters as I did in the first chapters that you've kind of read through usually more often because you're kind of keep going back through it. But again, this time around, I think I learned some good lessons from the first two books and from that standpoint, and paid a lot better attention and made sure that every single chapter was really delivering in a powerful way. As you well know, one of the things, especially when you're into business trade books, it's not that everyone sits down with it and reads it from, cover to cover in one sitting, nor do they read the chapters in order. They could read 3 chapters and then pick it up 2 months later. So the way you have to write it and actually accommodate for that at some level, is really important as well. And one of the differences, kind of going back to what we said about the difference between writing a 800 to 1,000 word magazine article versus writing a book, has to take those kinds of things into consideration.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people have a hero book or another book that they look at as kind of a template. Not that they would copy the book, but they say, I want my book to be like Good to Great, except it's going to be on this topic or something like this. Did you have any hero book or any books that you looked at as you were writing your book that you said, I want to make it kind of like this other book?
Yeah. And so I would say it's a hero book. I wouldn't necessarily presume to suggest I'm going to make it kind of like that, but I will say in terms of the way that the Leadership Challenge, written by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner, I think is a powerful book. It's a book that I think has gotten people to really think about leadership very differently. Of course, over time now it's in its 6th edition. It's in 22 languages. And, if at some point in time, even in a smaller way, I could extend the reach of the content so that I can get people thinking about their teams or thinking about accountability or thinking about, alignment and learning and development and other such benefits from how groups and teams can work together. If they can discover that for themselves, and I can do that at scale, whether it's at the scale of Kouzes and Posner or not, remains to be seen, of course, but that's what I'd really like from it. I mean, there is really nothing in this that's just for me about, I'm later, I'm in my early 60s right now. I'll be 61 next month, as a matter of fact. So it isn't really about trying to make money from the book or trying to make a killing in the consulting business or anything like that. It's really about believing in something and making sure that I want to get it into people's hands so that they can benefit from themselves.
It's really hard to see a project like a book through if you don't have that motivation, isn't it? I mean, I have so much respect for anybody who finishes a book, even if it's a bad book, because having done it, I know how much work goes into producing that. And I just can't imagine writing a book and not really caring deeply about it, because I'd give up.
Yeah, and that's where people lose steam, like we talked about, and don't always, carry that through. But I think if you have enough passion, about it, makes all the difference in the world.
Mm-hmm. Are there any resources, books, websites, anything that have been particularly helpful to you as an author, as a writer, whether it's books on how to write or the craft of writing or anything like that?
No, and the only reason I say that, other than Story First, with that Heather Pemberton Levy wrote, she worked with me pretty extensively in the first book. I wouldn't mind saying that. I mean, I think she really kind of held our hand, with writing that first book. It was the first book that I had done or Leon Shapiro had done. And I think she really gave us a master class in many respects on, how to think about this, how to do it. And, and I so connected, and I think her content, if you will, resonated with me in a way that I just pretty much adopted that and was far more probably, and this could be, a fault as well, but far more of a student of the content than I was on how to present it differently other than what I had learned, from her in writing the first book. But yeah, it's kind of at least how I kind of went about it. It was a bit, preoccupied with just getting the content right. In fact, I did these workshops for over 4 years because I really worked hard at pressure testing the content and making sure that this was something that no matter what situation I might find myself in, whether it was a group or a cross-functional work team, for example, that there wasn't any breakdowns in the way that this content delivered.
After your work with Levy on story, what's your philosophy today on the importance of story within business books? Is it something where you say story needs to be most of the book and the lessons are actually the smaller part? Or do you have any guiding philosophy on how to incorporate story into your books?
Well, I would say that story is really important. People like to have data. They like to have pieces of it that it shouldn't be told, kind of here's what somebody thinks and that's that. They want to be able to connect a story. They want to feel like there are personal experiences there. So I think this idea of leading with story, when it makes sense, and I think most of the chapters of Peernovation do lead with story. It's a way to draw you into what's going on so you can start building the case. And I do think that providing tangible takeaways for people, kind of summarizing, what you kind of went through and then walking into what's next and why, helps create, a good thread for people. Again, you never know kind of how people are going to read a book, but I think story is essential. I think if you have a book and there are no stories in it, I'm not sure I could, put a book together like that, because I think the stories are just so much fun, and the stories are so real. The stories in my book, like, you can't make them up. They are what they are, and I think in their own way offer some powerful lessons. So.
Well, thank you so much, Leo, for sharing this time with us today. Any parting words of wisdom or any final advice, especially for first-time authors out there?
I would just say that don't feel like this is something you can't do. I think oftentimes people feel like, well, the idea of writing a book is just so monumental and so big and they can't commit to it, whatever. But I think if you feel passionate about what you want to write about and, have at it and just start writing it. Don't try to overthink it, and just get into it and you'll find your way.
Great. Thank you so much. Where's the best place for people to find you?
leobottary.com or peernovation.co. Either one will take you to my website and they can learn about me, the work, the books, and how they can make Peernovation work for them.
Great. Thank you so much for being on with us today, Leo.
Okay. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.